The wind carried a dry whisper across the desert plains, moving through the tall grass like an old secret that refused to die. The sun was sinking behind the distant mesas, painting the horizon in shades of copper and blood. A small settlement stood at the edge of that emptiness, a lonely outpost clinging to the land, as if afraid it might disappear by morning. Wooden signs creaked in the wind, and the smell of dust, sweat, and old whiskey drifted from the saloon's open doors. It was a place where stories spread faster than the sandstorms, and where every man and woman carried something they'd rather forget. Inside that saloon, laughter mixed with the rattle of poker chips and the clinking of glasses. Cowboys leaned on the counter, soldiers off duty swapped tales, and women in faded silk dresses walked slow between the tables. But in the corner, at a table near the open window, sat a young woman whose eyes burned brighter than the lantern light. She was new in town, wearing a pale blue dress that didn't belong in a place like this. The men had already noticed her whispering about who she might be or what she was running from. Her voice carried softly across the room. But her words would change everything that night. "I bet the Apache chief is terrible in bed," she said with a half-smile. Her tone teasing, careless, the kind of remark that stirred laughter and risk all at once. A few men chuckled nervously, and someone dropped his drink. No one dared answer her, though. They all knew better than to speak the name of the man she was mocking. The Apache chief wasn't a myth here. He was real, and the stories about him carried weight heavier than bullets. Some said he was a ghost in the hills, moving with the wind, striking from nowhere, vanishing before sunrise. Others swore they'd seen him, his face painted with ash and red clay, his eyes cold as moonlight. To the settlers, he was a curse. To his people, he was justice. And now, this stranger, this bold young woman, had just spoken words that might call him down from the mountains. A man sitting by the window, an older trapper with gray hair and scars across his cheek, lifted his eyes slowly. "You shouldn't say things like that, miss," he muttered, his voice rough and low. "Not here. Not with that wind blowing east." She laughed softly, swirling the drink in her hand. "Why? You think he's listening?" The old man didn't answer. He just looked toward the darkening desert, where the orange sky was fading to blue. The air outside had gone still, too still. Like the land itself was holding its breath. Across the street, the blacksmith stopped hammering. The horses began to stir, snorting and shifting in their stalls. A faint sound rolled in from the distant hooves, slow and steady, moving closer with the rhythm of something ancient. Inside the saloon, the noise faded. The laughter, the music, even the shuffle of boots all went quiet. The young woman frowned, glancing toward the door as the light dimmed behind a tall shadow. He stepped inside without a word. Dust clung to his shoulders, his hair tied back with leather, his chest bare beneath a tattered coat. His eyes were dark, unreadable, and they swept across the room like a blade. No one moved. No one breathed. It was him. The Apache chief. He said nothing at first, only looked around, taking in every face until his gaze found Hertha, woman in blue, still sitting at the table, still pretending she wasn't afraid. Her fingers trembled slightly on the glass, but she didn't look away. The silence was heavy, stretching long enough for the old clock on the wall to tick 3 slow times. Then he spoke, his voice calm, but deep enough to make the walls seem smaller. "You have a brave tongue," he said, his accent rough, but clear. "You think I would not hear?" A few men shifted in their seats, but none dared step forward. The woman hesitated, then forced a smile. "It was just a joke," she said. "I didn't mean any harm." The chief's gaze didn't soften. "The wind carries every word," he said, "even lies." Something in his tone made her heart pound faster. He wasn't angry, not in the way she expected. There was something else in his eyes, a question, or maybe recognition. For a moment, she wondered if he knew her. If somehow their paths had crossed long before tonight, then without warning, he turned and walked back through the door. The sound of his boots faded into the night. The saloon stayed quiet for several breaths before the noise returned in whispers and nervous laughter. But the young woman didn't move. She stared at the doorway long after he was gone, her drink untouched, her pulse still racing. Something about him had unsettled her in a way she couldn't explain. Later that night, as the lamps burned low and the wind picked up again, she left the saloon and walked down the empty street. The moonlight cast her shadow long against the dirt, and every sound seemed to echo too loudly the rustle of her dress. The creak of old wood, the distant cry of a coyote. She stopped by the edge of town. Looking out toward the desert, the horizon stretched endless and silent, and yet she felt watched. Something about the chief's eyes haunted her. It's like he had seen right through her words, through her laughter, to the truth she tried to hide. Behind her, a horse neighed softly. She turned quickly, half expecting to see someone following, but the street was empty. Only the wind moved, lifting her hair and brushing her cheek like a warning. When she reached the boarding house, she closed the door behind her and leaned against it, trying to calm her breathing. From her window, she could see the faint glow of campfires far out in the desert. The Apache were out there watching, waiting, and one of them had heard her voice. Sleep didn't come easy. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, the way he had looked at her, the weight of his silence. She didn't understand why it mattered so much, why she felt drawn to someone she should fear. But deep down, she knew something had begun that night. Something neither of them could stop. By dawn, the town had already changed. The blacksmith's door hung open, and the sheriff rode out early, heading toward the hills with a rifle across his lap. People whispered that the Apaches had been seen closer than usual, their tracks fresh near the river. Some said they were preparing for war. Others thought they were only watching, waiting for a sign. The young woman tried to go about her morning, but her hands shook as she poured her coffee. Every sound outside made her flinch: the creak of a saddle, the bark of a dog, the cry of a hawk overhead. She told herself it was foolish to worry, that the man she'd met wouldn't come back. But part of her knew better. That night, as the sun went down once more, she found herself standing by the window again, looking toward the desert. The wind carried the faint sound of drums, far away but steady, like a heartbeat in the distance. And then she saw a figure standing at the edge of the hills, motionless against the dying light. She couldn't see his face, but she knew it was him, the chief watching. Her breath caught in her throat as their eyes met across the vast distance, something unspoken passing between them. Fear, curiosity, and something else she couldn't name. The drums grew louder. The wind rose again, and the young woman realized, too late, that her careless words had already tied her fate to his. The desert held its breath once more, waiting for what would come next. Morning came slow and uneasy. A red sun rose over the mesas, spilling light over the town like a wound reopening. The settlement that had seemed ordinary a day before now felt different, too quiet, too aware. People moved with hushed voices, glancing toward the hills as if expecting something to rise from them. Even the horses were restless, stamping and snorting in the dust. The young woman, who had come to this forgotten corner of the territory less than a week ago, stood outside the boarding house with her shawl drawn tight. Her name had been whispered by a few, but most didn't know it, and she preferred it that way. She said she came west to start over, to leave behind the noise of her old life. But no one in this place believed anyone came west for peace. Everyone was running from something: law, heartbreak, memory. She had found work at the saloon for a few coins a night, singing when asked, serving when needed. It wasn't much, but it paid for a bed and a meal. That had been enough until last night, when her careless words had hung in the air like a curse. Now, as she watched the horizon, the image of the Apache chief standing in the fading light stayed with her. The way he had looked at her, steady, unblinking, unreadable, had shaken her in a way she didn't understand. There had been no hatred in his eyes, only something deeper, something that felt like warning and curiosity woven together. The sheriff rode through town around mid-morning, dust rising from his horse's hooves. He was a tall man with a heavy coat and a rifle strapped across his back. He stopped by the saloon talking to the owner, and every few minutes his gaze flicked toward the desert. Word spread that Apache riders had been seen near the river again, watching but not attacking. It wasn't unusual, but after last night's incident, People were uneasy. Inside the saloon, the same old crowd gathered, pretending life was normal. Cards were shuffled. Whiskey poured. But the laughter sounded forced. The young woman moved among them quietly, her thoughts elsewhere. She caught pieces of talk about the chief, about his tribe, about old fights and raids. The stories were always different. Some said he was born under a blood moon and could hear voices in the wind. Others claimed he had lost his wife and child to settlers years ago, that he carried their memory like a scar that never healed. A few swore he wasn't cruel, only proud, protecting what little his people had left. But the one thing everyone agreed on was that he didn't forgive insults easily. That evening, the trapper who had warned her the night before sat by the fire outside the saloon, cleaning his old rifle. She hesitated before walking over, her boots crunching on the gravel. "You were right," she said softly. "He did hear me." The old man looked up, his eyes squinting against the sun. "You got lucky, girl. If he wanted trouble, this town would already be smoke." She lowered her voice. "Who is he, really?" The trapper wiped his hands on his coat and leaned back. "Name folks use for him is Taza, means son of the dawn or something like that. His father was a chief before him, one of the few who tried making peace with the army. Got betrayed for his trouble. Taza grew up watching his people lose everything, cattle, kin. He don't talk much, don't smile neither, but he's no savage. He's a man who remembers." She listened quietly, feeling something shift inside her. The way the trapper spoke didn't match the stories she'd heard. Taza wasn't just a shadow in the desert. He was human, scarred by the same kind of loss that drove everyone west. "Why would he come here?" she asked. The old man shrugged. "Could be many reasons. Maybe he was just passing through. Maybe he wanted to see the kind of people who joke about him. Or maybe he's looking for something or someone." His last words lingered, and she couldn't shake them off. That night, she found herself standing at the edge of town again, staring toward the hills. The wind was cooler now, carrying the faint scent of smoke and sagebrush. Somewhere far out there, drums pulsed again, steady as a heartbeat. Sleep didn't come. When it finally did, it brought dreams of fire and horses running wild across the plains. She woke before dawn to the sound of a coyote and the feeling that she wasn't alone. Outside her window, just beyond the fence, she saw movement, something tall and still, half lost in the mist. For a moment her heart stopped. Then she realized it was him. The chief. He stood watching, not moving, his face unreadable in the gray light. She didn't know how long they looked at each other, but it felt like a long time. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the desert fog. The next day, the tension in town thickened. The sheriff ordered extra patrols. The storekeeper refused to sell ammunition unless you showed a badge. Mothers kept their children inside. The young woman tried to keep her head down, but everywhere she went, she felt eyes on her. A few people had guessed that her words had brought the chief to town. Though they didn't say it aloud, she saw it in their glances. That afternoon, a soldier rode in from the fort, dusty and pale. He brought word that an army supply wagon had been attacked the night before, its guards left alive but stripped of weapons. "Apache tracks," he said, though no one was sure. The sheriff gathered a small group of men to ride out and see for themselves. She watched them leave from the saloon porch, her hands trembling. She didn't know why she cared, but something deep inside her whispered that things were about to change. Hours passed. The sun dipped low again, casting long shadows over the town. The riders didn't return. By dusk, a strange unease spread through the streets. The wind picked up, carrying the faint sound of a flute, soft, distant, and haunting. People stopped what they were doing to listen. The music was beautiful and sorrowful. Floating over the desert like a memory, the young woman stood frozen, her heart pounding. She knew that sound wasn't coming from town. It was coming from the hills. The trapper appeared beside her, his face pale. "That's an Apache morning song," he whispered. "Means someone's spirit's walking tonight." She turned toward the darkness beyond the mesas, fear mixing with a strange pull she couldn't explain. The melody grew stronger for a moment, then faded away, leaving only the rustle of the wind. Later that night, as lanterns burned low, someone knocked on her door. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the latch. When she finally opened it, a folded piece of leather sat on the step, bound with a strip of sinew. No one was in sight. Inside the leather was a single feather and a small piece of carved wood. The carving was simpler, horse running beneath a rising sun. She stared at it, her breath catching. She didn't know what it meant, but she felt it wasn't a threat. It was a message. The next morning, the sheriff's men returned without the soldier who had brought the warning. They said they found the wagon abandoned near the river. No bodies, no blood, only hoof prints leading into the hills. When the sheriff passed her on the street, his eyes narrowed. "If you know anything about this, now's the time to talk." "I don't," she said quietly, "but I think he's trying to say something." The sheriff snorted. "He's saying, stay off his land. That's what." He rode away, but his words didn't ease her mind. That night, she walked out to the river alone. The moonlight made the water glow silver, and the air was filled with the sound of crickets. She held the carving in her palm, tracing the lines with her thumb. Somewhere across the water, she heard a horse. Then a low voice broke the silence. "You still speak with the wind," the voice said. Her heart leaped. She turned toward the sound and saw him again, half hidden by the trees. The Apache chief sat astride his horse, watching her in silence. "I didn't mean what I said," she whispered. "I know," he answered. "But words have wings. They fly far." She stepped closer, though fear tightened her chest. "Why did you come back?" He paused, then said quietly, "Because your voice reached me before your heart did." Before she could reply, he turned his horse and rode into the night, leaving her standing by the water, clutching the carving as if it held the answers to everything she didn't yet understand. Behind her, the town lights flickered, and the sound of drums rose again from the hills, steady, patient, waiting for the moment when the line between fear and fate would finally break. The days that followed were tense in ways the young woman could almost taste, heavy like dust in her mouth. The town carried a hush, a quiet that had nothing to do with peace. People moved like shadows, quick glances over shoulders, hands lingering near rifles or knives. The saloon no longer rang with careless laughter. Even the piano in the corner seemed to play softer. Almost afraid of the wind that whispered through the swinging doors, she stayed close to the edge of town more often now. Drawn by curiosity she couldn't name, and a fear that clung to her chest like a cold stone. Each morning, she would watch the hills, hoping not to see him, and yet dreading the day when he wouldn't appear at all. She didn't know if it was courage or foolishness that kept her walking the empty streets alone. Meanwhile, the sheriff grew increasingly uneasy. He gathered the townsfolk one evening, pacing in front of the wooden boardwalks as the sun bled red behind the mesas. "This ain't just a warning," said his voice rising with each word. "It's a message. That Apache Chief Tazahi's testing us. We don't know why, we don't know how, but we ignore it at our peril. Keep your eyes open and your hands ready." Some nodded, others muttered. A few men muttered about taking rifles and riding out themselves. But the sheriff cut them short with a glare that could make a man freeze. Mid-dash step, the young woman listened from the doorway, gripping the shawl tighter around her shoulders. She wondered why Taza's presence unsettled her more than the sheriff's warnings. His silence had weight, but it carried a story she couldn't yet understand, though it seemed to pull her closer with every heartbeat. That night, she walked to the river again, carrying the carved piece of wood he had left her.
Ow.
The moon shone silver, and the water rippled with the wind. Somewhere in the distance, the drums began again, slow and steady, like a heartbeat stretched across the desert. She heard a sound behind her, a rustle, soft and deliberate. She froze, every nerve alive. "You come alone," a voice said. She turned slowly, expecting a shadow, a trick of the moonlight. Instead, Taza emerged from the brush, his horse standing patiently behind him. His eyes were dark, unreadable, but something in them held warmth this time. "I didn't mean any harm," she said softly. "I know," he replied, his tone even quiet. "But the land carries words farther than you imagine." She nodded, unsure what to say. The river's current seemed louder now, carrying everything away, except the feeling that something bigger was stirring just beyond the hills. Back in town, rumors began to grow. People talked in hushed tones about the wagon attacked near the river, about missing soldiers, and about the strange rhythms of the drums that seemed to echo from nowhere. Some said the Apaches were angry. Others whispered that Taza sought something lost long ago. Fear and curiosity danced together, feeding a tension no one could quite name. The trapper stayed close to the young woman during the day, offering advice in rough words and quiet warnings. "You're messing with things bigger than a town or a sheriff," he said one afternoon. "That chief, he's smart. You don't strike blindly. If he comes here, it's got meaning. Keep your ears open and your tongue still." She wanted to argue, to claim she was careful, but she realized he was right. Each step she took, each glance she threw toward the hills, carried risk. Yet she felt she couldn't stop herself from looking. One morning, as the sun climbed high, the young woman found herself near the saloon's back alley. A group of soldiers had gathered quietly, discussing patrols and the rising tension with the Apaches. They argued over strategy, debating whether to track the chief or wait for him to act. "He's not a fool," one said, slamming his fist against the table. "He knows the land better than any of us. If he wants something, he'll get it without ever crossing us openly." "She's right," another added, glancing toward the boarding house where the young woman had stood watching. "We don't know his moves. We can't guess what he's after." The young woman lingered nearby, pretending to fetch water from the barrel. Their words stuck with her. She realized the conflict wasn't just between the town and Taza. It was deeper, older, a tension woven into the land. The wind and the hills themselves. That afternoon, a stranger rode into town, a trader with a dusty cart and wary eyes. He carried news from settlements farther west, Apache activity, more sightings of Taza's people, and hints of a larger movement. The townsfolk gathered around, listening as he spoke, trading stories of fear and respect. "He moves like the wind," the trader said, unrolling a map on the saloon's floor. "Never seen a man lead like him. The Apache trust him, but he doesn't waste words. You don't insult him without consequences. It's that young woman. She needs to watch her back." The words made the young woman stiffen, her hands tightening around the shawl. She wanted to hide, to disappear into the shadows, but a strange pull kept her rooted to the floorboards. As night fell, the drums rose again from the hills. The town lights flickered, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the dirt streets. People shuttered windows, barred doors, and whispered prayers. Fear was growing into something tangible, wrapping itself around hearts and minds. The young woman couldn't stay away. She walked toward the edge of town, toward the river that had become a place of strange meetings and unanswered questions. She carried the carved wood and feather, symbols she couldn't yet interpret, but felt she must protect. Taza emerged from the darkness again, silent as the desert itself. His horse stepped lightly, hooves barely making sound on the gravel. He stopped a few paces away, studying her. "You return?" he said, voice quiet, calm. "Why, I don't know," she admitted. "I feel like I need to understand." He studied her longer, the fire of the moonlight in his eyes. Understanding takes more than courage. It takes patience, and sometimes it takes fear. She felt fear, but not the kind that made her run. This fear was different. It sharpened her senses, made the air heavier, the night deeper. It drew her closer to him, to the truth she sensed but could not name. Meanwhile, in town, the sheriff and the townsfolk prepared for the possibility of conflict. They stocked weapons, reinforced doors, and kept watch over the horizon. Each shadow, each sound, made them jump. The tension wasn't just with the Apaches, it was among themselves. Who would act first? Who would falter? The young woman wandered back to the river, carrying the carvings in her hands. The wind lifted the feather slightly, making it dance. She felt eyes on her, the quiet presence of someone waiting. The pulse of the drums echoed closer now, surrounding her in the dark. And then, from the other side of the water, the chief's voice called again, low and deliberate. You are tied to words you don't understand." She shivered, knowing he was right. Every step she took, every glance, every breath had weight. She didn't know if it was destiny, accident, or something older than both. But she knew one thing, clearly there was no turning back. The night deepened, stretching the desert silence between town and hills. The wind rose, carrying with it dust, whispers, and the faint, steady beat of drums. Every creature, every human, every sound seemed attuned to a coming moment. Something that would break the ordinary flow of life into danger and revelation. The young woman held the carvings closer, watching the darkened hills. Somewhere out there, Taza waited, watching, judging, patient as the land itself in town. The sheriff checked his rifle again. The trapper muttered old warnings, and families huddled in the faint lamplight. Everyone felt its uneasy pull of a storm that wasn't in the sky. But in the desert, moving like a shadow over hearts, over minds, over every life caught between fear and fascination, and across the river, a lone horse stirred in the darkness. Its rider, silent and still, seemed to melt into the night, a figure of mystery and power. The story was far from over. The words, the warnings, and the wind had set a chain in motion, and no one could yet tell where it would lead. Every glance, every step, every heartbeat in the town carried the tension further, building toward a moment that waited beyond the next sunrise, beyond the next shadow, beyond the next drumbeat. And the young woman realized in the quiet of the night that she had stepped into a story that belonged neither entirely to her nor to the town, but to the land, the wind, and the man she could neither understand nor ignore. The desert held its breath, and so did she. The night that followed felt heavier than any she had known. The desert air pressed against her skin like a living thing, thick with the scent of sagebrush and distant smoke. Stars hung in the sky, bright and cruel, as if watching her every move. She couldn't sleep, her mind racing with thoughts of the chief, of the carvings, of the drums that never seemed to fade from the hills in town. Every door was barred, every window shuttered. The sheriff and his men patrolled the streets in tight circles, their boots crunching against the gravel. Lanterns flickered in the wind, casting shadows that twisted and danced across the buildings, making the ordinary seem dangerous. Even the saloon had emptied early, its piano silent, its chairs stacked against the wall. The town was waiting, though no one knew exactly for what. The young woman moved quietly to the river, clutching the carved wood and feather close to her chest. The wind lifted the feather gently, making it dance as though it were alive. She reached the water and peered into its dark reflection, searching for answers in the silver ripples. The drum beat grew louder, stronger, each thump matching the quickening of her pulse. From the shadows of the riverbank, a figure emerged. Taza. He stepped lightly, his horse quiet beneath him, eyes fixed on her as if measuring the weight of her courage. He dismounted slowly, his presence commanding yet silent, like a shadow stretching across the desert. "You shouldn't be here alone," he said, voice low and calm. "The land isn't kind to those who wander in the dark." "I had to see," she whispered. "I need to understand why. Why you came, why you watch, why you care." Taz's eyes darkened, and for a moment she saw something behind them, memories she could not name. Pain that had shaped him into a man both feared and revered. "Care is not the right word," he said. "But the wind carries things that matter. You spoke carelessly, and the wind brought your words to me." She swallowed hard, feeling the truth of his statement. Everything she had thought was private, careless, playful, had reached him, and now she was standing here, facing a man who was more than legend, more than fear, and more than any tale the town had whispered. Meanwhile, the town stirred with whispers of danger. Rumors traveled faster than the wind. Soldiers reported seeing tracks near the river, some strange, others familiar. The blacksmith tightened the doors to his shop, hiding the new rifles he'd smuggled in from a distant fort. Mothers kept children close, while fathers muttered prayers under their breath. Tension rolled through the streets like a storm gathering in the hills. The young woman could feel it, too. The land itself was alert. Every gust of wind, every distant call of a coyote, Every rustle of leaves seemed to warn her that the coming night would change everything. She didn't understand why, but she knew that the moments ahead would test courage, judgment, and fate. As dusk fell, Taza led her to a higher ridge overlooking the river. The moonlight spilled over the valley, painting the desert silver and black. He stopped, looking down at the town lights, flickering like fireflies in the distance. "They are ready," he said. "The town prepares to fight what it doesn't understand. And you have stepped into a story that belongs neither to them nor to me, but to the land and its memory." Her heart pounded. "What do you mean?" "I mean that words have power and actions have consequences. You spoke of me lightly, but the wind does not forget. The people here, they think they are ready. They are not." She stared at him, understanding more than she wanted to. Fear mixed with fascination. His presence, silent yet commanding, drew her closer, yet reminded her that she was still very small in the vastness of the desert and the unfolding story. Back in town? The sheriff gathered his men once more. He spoke quietly, deliberately, trying to keep calm in the face of what he sensed was coming. "We hold our ground," he said. "We wait for him to act, and we act only when we must. The Apaches respect strength, but we must be careful. One wrong move, and He didn't finish the sentence, letting the fear hang in the air. The young woman returned to the boarding house after sunset. The wind had risen, carrying with it the faint echo of drums, steady and patient. She could feel it vibrating in her chest, a rhythm older than any of the town's wooden buildings, older than the mesas themselves. She held the carvings tighter, feeling them pulse almost as if alive. Then, a distant cry broke the night. A coyote, a hawk, or perhaps something else. She wasn't sure, but she sensed eyes watching her from the hills. The feeling was familiar now. It's the same that had gripped her since the first encounter. Taza appeared again, silent as the shadows. "You cannot pretend the town and I are separate," he said. "Your words have tied you here. You feel it, do you not? The tension in the streets, the fear in their hearts. They do not understand the choice you have made." She nodded. "I feel it, but I cannot step away. I need to know." "Then you will see," he replied, "and you will understand what it means to speak, to act, and to exist in the spaces between fear and respect." The night stretched long. In town, people kept watch, some peeking from windows, others sitting by lanterns, rifles in hand. The sheriff moved from door to door, offering reassurance that felt brittle even to him. The wind whispered through empty streets, carrying words he couldn't hear, carrying warnings he couldn't interpret. By midnight, a small group of men attempted to track what they thought were Apache movements along the river. The young woman watched from her window, gripping the carvings. She could see shadows moving in the moonlight, fast, silent, deliberate. Each rustle of brush, each shift of sand, seemed to echo with the presence of Taza and his people. Suddenly, the drums rose again, louder now, surrounding the town in a rhythm that seemed alive. Windows rattled, doors shook slightly, and even the horses stirred nervously in their stalls. A cold hush fell over the settlement. The sheriff's men froze mid-step, listening. Some whispered prayers, others cursed under their breath. The young woman's heart raced as she felt the pull of the drums. She didn't know if she wanted to flee or follow, if she wanted safety or truth. Both called to her in equal measure. Both carried the same weight of inevitability. From the ridge, Taza's silhouette appeared against the moonlight, his horse still, his figure tall and commanding. He looked down at the town below, at the people who thought they could control what they did not understand. His gaze then found her, and for a moment the world fell away, leaving only the two of them in the quiet tension of the night. The wind lifted, carrying whispers of old stories, stories of betrayal, of honor, of survival. The young woman could feel it brushing against her skin, pressing against her mind. She realized that every word she had spoken, every glance, every action, shaped the moment now unfolding. In town, the sheriff paced nervously. The men at his side whispered, uncertain whether to wait or strike. Fear mingled with resolve, but neither fully dominated. They were caught between action and hesitation. and the desert stretched silent and watchful. Ready to witness the consequence of every choice, the young woman stepped out onto the balcony, feeling the pulse of the drums in her chest. Her eyes scanned the hills, searching for him, feeling him in the rhythm of the wind. She knew that the moments ahead would not only test the town, the chief, and herself, but would demand courage and truth from everyone involved. The moon dipped lower, casting longer shadows. The desert seemed to lean closer, holding its breath. The drums grew louder, surrounding the town, surrounding her. Surrounding the space between what was known and what was coming. Then, from the ridge above the river, Taz's voice called once more, low and clear. The moment draws near. What you have set in motion cannot be undone. Her heart pounded. The town waited, the sheriff waited, and the wind carried a tension so thick it seemed to choke the stars from the sky. Every shadow, every rustle of brush, every whispered fear prepared the stage for a confrontation that could change everything. The young woman clutched the carvings close, feeling their weight, their significance, and the inevitability that she was now a part of a story bigger than her, bigger than the town, bigger than the desert itself. From the hills, the drums rose to a crescendo, the wind whipped the dust into the streets, and Taz's figure loomed in the moonlight, still silent, commanding. The town could feel the approach of something immense, something that could not be avoided. A storm of human will and destiny converging on a single point. The night waited, and so did she, heart racing, breath shallow, every nerve alive with the anticipation of what was coming next. The desert held its silence, the town its fear, and the wind carried the truth none could yet speak. The stage was set. Every whispered word, every shadowed movement, every heartbeat was leading to a moment that would test courage, loyalty, and the power of words. And in the midst of it all, the young woman realized there was no turning back. The desert held its breath through the night, the wind finally settling into a quiet hum. The town, once tense with fear, began to stir cautiously in the first pale light of dawn. Shadows retreated from the boardwalks and streets as the sun rose over the mesas, turning the sand and rocks into a glowing gold. People emerged slowly, their movements tentative, eyes scanning the hills, as if expecting a final threat to descend at any moment. The young woman stepped outside her boarding house, clutching the carvings Taza had given her. They were worn and simple, but somehow she now understood they held more than meaning. They held a bridge between two worlds. The wind whispered through the town, and for the first time in days, it carried a sense of peace. Cautious but real, Taza appeared on the ridge above the river, his silhouette calm and resolute in the morning light. He watched the town from afar, his presence still commanding but no longer menacing. The drums had faded overnight, leaving only the natural sounds of the desert, the rustle of brush, the chirp of birds, the occasional call of a distant hawk. The young woman felt an unexpected courage swell in her chest. She walked down the path toward the river, stepping lightly over the dry grass and rocks. When she reached the riverbank, Taza was waiting, the horse grazing quietly nearby. He regarded her with the same intensity as before, but now there was a softness behind his dark eyes. A weight lifted from his shoulders. "You understood," he said, simply. "I think I did," she replied, her voice steady. "And I think I understand why you came." It wasn't anger. Not really, it was warning, guidance, maybe even patience. Taza nodded slowly. "The land carries stories. Your words reached farther than you knew. Some words wound. Some words teach. You have learned the difference." In town, the sheriff and his men walked the streets cautiously, inspecting the aftermath of the tension. There were no attacks, no signs of violence. Even the tracks near the river suggested nothing more than careful passage. The soldiers returned to the fort, their faces a mixture of relief and lingering respect for Taza and his people. Whispers of the events spread quickly, but the fear that had gripped the town was replaced by something quieter, curiosity and cautious admiration. The blacksmith unlocked his doors, letting in the morning light, and the sound of hammer striking metal echoed through the streets. Work resumed, not with careless chatter, but with a sense of purpose and reflection. The townsfolk moved with careful steps, their eyes occasionally drifting toward the hills. A reminder that the desert had its own rules, and that some stories carried lessons heavier than gold. The young woman and Taza stood together at the river's edge. The carvings lay between them, a symbol now of understanding, respect, and the fragile connection that had been forged through tension and words. "You are brave," Taza said, his voice low but filled with approval. "Not for facing danger, but for listening, for feeling, for accepting the weight of your own words. Many do not." She looked down at the carvings, then up at him. "I was careless before, but I've learned. You've taught me without saying much. I understand now that what we say matters, that it can carry farther than we imagine." He inclined his head. "And what about the town?" "They'll learn too," she said. "They'll understand the value of respect, the cost of fear, the way a single action can ripple farther than anyone expects. They'll carry the lesson forward, and maybe they'll be stronger for it." Taza studied her silently for a long moment, then turned his horse. He rode slowly back toward the hills, the morning light casting long shadows behind him. The young woman watched until he disappeared, the wind brushing her hair and carrying with it the faint echo of drums, gentle now, like a heartbeat fading into memory, in the days that followed. The town began to return to life, shaped now by the lessons of the past week. Conversations were quieter, thoughtful. People listened more. Respect for the land and for those who lived on it became a quiet undercurrent in every action. The sheriff walked with steadier purpose. Knowing the desert's power and the chief's presence had left an impression that would endure. The young woman resumed her work at the saloon, but now with a calmness that was new. She served patrons with a gentle smile, spoke when spoken to, and kept a quiet watch on the horizon. She no longer felt fear in the same way. It had transformed into awareness, a deep connection to the land and the stories it carried. The trapper approached her one morning, carrying his rifle slung over his shoulder, a rare smile on his face. "You did well," he said. "More than most would. You kept your head, your courage, and your heart in the right place." She smiled back. "I had help, and I had to face myself too," he nodded. "That's the hardest part, and the part most people avoid. You didn't. You faced it, and you learned." Out beyond the hills, Taz's people were seen moving silently, careful and watchful, returning to their own lives. Their chief remained a figure of mystery, but now one that carried not only fear, but also respect. The town, though still wary, began to understand that some stories were bigger than themselves, and some lessons required patience and humility. The young woman often returned to the river. Standing at the same spot where she had first met him, where the carvings had changed hands, she felt a quiet strength there, a connection to something timeless, and a reminder that words and actions carried weight beyond the moment. One evening, she stood by the river, the sunset painting the sky in deep reds and oranges. The water reflected the colors like a mirror, calm and endless. She ran her fingers over the carvings once more, feeling the smooth wood and the feathers' delicate softness. They had become symbols of her journey, of the tension she had faced, and of the growth she had gained. The town below her hummed with life, cautious but alive. Children played along the boardwalks, men worked with steady purpose, and women moved through the streets with watchful eyes. There was a new rhythm to the town, shaped by fear transformed into wisdom, and by respect born from confrontation. The young woman smiled quietly. She understood now that the Apache chief's presence had not been a threat, but a lesson. It had forced her and the town to confront themselves, to see beyond their own assumptions, and to acknowledge the power of actions, words, and understanding. As she watched the river, she thought of Taza, and the lessons he had given without speaking much. She felt gratitude, respect, and a quiet awe for the man who had appeared out of legend and left an impression deeper than any fear could have. The desert, vast and timeless, seemed to echo her thoughts. It was alive with stories, with lessons carried by wind and sand, and with the knowledge that every choice mattered. The sun sank below the horizon, and the river glowed under the first stars. The town, the young woman, and the hills themselves now held a shared understanding, a connection forged through tension, courage, and reflection. There was a harmony born from the storm that had passed, a calm that carried the weight of what had been learned, and as she turned to walk back to the boarding house, the carvings tucked safely in her hands, she knew she would never forget the lessons of the desert, the town, or the Apache chief who had changed everything with his presence. The wind whispered through the trees and the grass, gentle now, carrying with it a quiet promise that the stories of courage, of words, and of respect would live on in the town, in the young woman. And in the land that had witnessed it all, the river flowed on. The hills stood silent and patient, and the desert held the memory of what had passed. Life resumed its rhythm, but forever marked by the encounter that had tested hearts and wills alike. And in that quiet, in that calm, the young woman felt a sense of closure, not in answers alone, but in understanding. She had faced fear, she had seen courage, and she had learned the true weight of words. The desert, the town, and the Apache chief had all left their mark, and she carried it forward, stronger, wiser, and ready for whatever stories the wind would bring next. The sun rose the next morning over the mesas, casting gold across the streets and rooftops. The town woke fully, alive with energy tempered by reflection. And though Taza had returned to the hills, his presence lingered not as threat, but as a reminder of the power of respect, patience, and understanding in a world where every word mattered. The young woman walked among the townsfolk. Finally feeling at home in a place that had once felt so foreign, she smiled at those she passed, her eyes carrying a quiet confidence, a knowledge that the events of the past week had shaped her forever. And with the river flowing steadily, the wind carrying its whispers across the desert, and the hills standing watchful and eternal, life continued forever changed, quietly hopeful, and filled with the promise of new stories waiting to be told.